Welcome back, everybody, to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink. Indiana falls 85-66 Wednesday night against Penn State at the Bryce Jordan Center. To help us make sense of what's going on right now with this Indiana team, Tyler Tachman of the Indianapolis Star is here. Tyler, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me. I think making sense of this is going to be a tall task, but I would try my best.
So that's kind of where I want to start. There's injuries, obviously. There's defensive problems. Is it as simple as that, or is there something deeper right now than injuries and the defense that are broken with this Indiana team?
My main point, and this goes for the Northwestern game and to a certain extent some of the Iowa game too, is that the injuries hurt. Look, I don't want to underplay that. Losing Race Thompson, losing Xavier Johnson, those are big losses. Those are guys not only that are really key pieces to what Indiana has done, and but also just the experience they have. They're veteran guys. They've been around the college game for a while. Don't want to underplay that, but it's not an excuse to look this bad. I think that there's an expectation that without those two guys, Indiana's level of play would go down a little bit, and they wouldn't look as good as, maybe they did against North Carolina and against Xavier, 2 wins that now seem a distant past. But I think so. Like I said, I think the level of play, there's an expectation the level of play without them would go down. But to look this bad, to look this disjointed, this dysfunctional, I don't really think there's an excuse for that, because it wasn't just like, Penn State is a fine team. They're I think Micah Shrewsbury is doing a really good job. But I mean, Indiana just got blown out. Like it was an embarrassment. And last season you could look at potentially an excuse being that, look, this is Mike Woodson in his first season. They have a bunch of, new pieces. They're trying to figure out how to play together. They're trying to figure out how to play under Mike Woodson. Those excuses as well now, I don't feel like are valid. Mike Woodson is now in his second season as head coach. A handful of these guys have now been teammates for more than a year. I just, a lot of the things you can look at as like, Indiana should be playing much better regardless of whether they have 2 key guys out. I just don't really see many excuses of why they look so bad.
Yeah, one of the things last night that was a little bit confusing to me, Mike Woodson's postgame, he said we're young and mentioned, not using the guys being out as an excuse. And then you just kind of look at who actually played the minutes last night. Jalen Hood-Schifino played 33. Okay, he's young, he counts. But Trace Jackson Davis plays 33 minutes. This is his 4th year of college. Trey Galloway, 31 minutes, 3rd year. Miller Kopp, 29 minutes, 5th year of college. Jordan Geronimo, 23 minutes. It's his 3rd year. Tamar Bates, 23 minutes. It's his 2nd year of college. Besides that, I mean, Malik Renew played 11. He's young, but that to me just doesn't fly, saying this is a young team. Do you agree with that, Tyler? And I mean, maybe it's not as talented of a team as we thought going into the season. Some of these guys we're going to talk about, I think, later in the show, and maybe are a little bit too one-dimensional. But I don't necessarily think at this point it's a youth problem for Indiana.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I think that if you look across the board, basically with Race and Xavier out, you needed some of these guys that have been role players to take on bigger responsibilities. And they've shown an incapability to do that so far. I think development is part of the issue. I think that there is development, but I don't think it's at the rate that's necessary. I think, Trey Galloway is shooting it better, but is he a guy that you can rely on to carry a team on a game-by-game basis? Is, Jordan Geronimo doesn't look much more improved than the guy he did his freshman season. Obviously the ceiling is there, the incredible athletic ability is there, but his game is still really unpolished. And now in his third college season, I think you'd want him to be a lot further along in his development than he is. You look at a guy like Tamar Bates, who has made strides, but at the same time, he hasn't been, I think, still the guy that Indiana really needs him to be. So when you look at just from the development standpoint, I think there have been some strides. I just don't think it's at the level that it needs to be. And I look around the league, and you look at a team like Rutgers losing Geo Baker, losing Ron Harper Jr., and they're playing really well. Like the pieces they lost in the guys are like a Cliff Omori, who you've kind of seen consistently take steps forward. It feels like Indiana hasn't had that same level of internal growth that is needed. I just feel like Indiana. I think the talent isn't an issue, really. I think it's probably not as at the level you would want it, but I don't think talent is an issue. I think it's more the unquantifiable things, the development, the mental toughness, the ability to like grit through tough situations and win. And also going back to the point about other teams around the league, Ohio State loses Malachi Branham and EJ Liddell, and I mean they're still finding a way to win games. So it's like you kind of just sometimes have to find a way to win with regardless of who you have on the court, and Indiana just not finding ways to do that.
Indiana's leadership right now too seems a little bit, well, maybe a little bit's not the right word. It's severely lacking, both from a coaching standpoint and from an on-court leadership. I would say right now Indiana is deficient in both areas. The thing I would say from a coaching perspective is coming into the game yesterday, it was easy kind of to see what Penn State was going to do. You look at their Ken Pom profile, they're going to take a lot of threes. They're going to space the floor. Indiana still looked unprepared to me, give up 18 3-pointers. And it's not like it happened like in a spurt of 10 to 15. It was like throughout the game, right? And nothing changed. And then the other thing I just kind of wonder about, Tyler, I remember back, I think it was the first season you worked for Inside the Hall. I remember Indiana went on the road and played I think it was a Big Ten ACC Challenge game at Florida State. And afterwards, Trace Jackson Davis gave a press conference and talking about how he wanted this Indiana team to be different and they didn't want to kind of be the same as the teams in the past. And those were comments that I've kind of stuck in my mind from Trace Jackson Davis. And we've seen at times last season, particularly down the stretch, he was a leader in terms of, helping his team get back to the tournament and putting his team on his back. But just, excuse me, in terms of his on-floor leadership, we've never seen that consistently out of Indiana with him on the floor. And that's no indictment on him as a player. He's been obviously very productive. I'm not being critical. I'm just curious if you think on the court, Indiana needs other guys to step up beyond Trace, and if what just kind of your reaction to when you think back on those comments that he made after that game, it doesn't really feel like Indiana's in any much of a different place in terms of its player driven leadership.
Yeah, that's an interesting point because I was actually just thinking about the same thing. I think part of the thing with Trace is that it seems like just naturally he's not as demonstrative as a guy, so that I think part of that leadership just might not manifest as much with him really showing a ton of emotion consistently. I give a lot of credit to him because he basically said after the Northwestern game that he's going through a treatment, whatever, he's going to play as much as Indiana needs. And I think he has given pretty much everything that you would want to this program. He's stuck through ups and downs. You probably would look at it and say you want him to develop more of a perimeter game, a 15-footer or whatever. But I feel like really that Indiana basketball and things could change this season, but it's not looking great. But that Indiana basketball has kind of failed Trace Jackson Davis because he has given so much to the program. He's stuck around. He's seemed to pretty much give everything that he can. And it just hasn't worked out around him. I think you could look at it at the sense of, well, can he not be the leader of a winning team? I don't really see it like that. I see it from the sense of Indiana just hasn't done enough around him. And I know there's various arguments to that, but the way that he has seemed to at least grown, and really taking ownership of wanting to get Indiana back on top, something that he has talked about a lot. I don't think it's a lack of effort on his part.
On my first point there, what do you think just about the leadership from the coaching perspective and kind of going into the game? Maybe you look at Northwestern game, right? They come out, they spot them 17 points, and they can't do anything defensively to stop Northwestern from driving straight line drive. Last night, it's overhelping on defense and allowing them to make 18 3-pointers. How much of that do you think is on the players and how much is on the coaches for not having them kind of prepared and dialed in on the game plan to execute?
I think, excuse me, I think it's a combination of them both. From, I guess, the leadership standpoint more, it just feels like when Indiana gets in trouble, like they just can't stop the bleeding. Like things just compound. And I look back and it feels like Indiana just is unable to learn from its mistakes. And maybe they're learning, but they're not growing from them, because the game at Iowa this season, when Indiana was up by 21 points in the first half, felt so similar to the game at Wisconsin last season. You look at both of those games, Indiana got off to a really good start, a really big lead in the first half, and then they just fell apart and ended up losing those games. It just feels like there's too many of the same mistakes happening. And at a certain point, like, I don't know whether that's coaching leadership. I don't know whether that's player leadership. It's probably a combination of both, but like, you just have to figure out how to get things done. Like, you have to figure out a way to scrap. You got to figure a way to stop the other team's momentum. And, back to that Iowa game this season, it's like, I know the lead had been cut into by the time Race Thompson goes out, but like, just because Race Thompson goes out doesn't mean you stop doing what you had done to build the lead. Like, you can't just stop playing at the level that you were to start the game. And I think, we've seen these flashes of what Indiana can be. And you can say that over the last few seasons, and those were Indiana teams that mostly weren't very good. So it's like, bad teams can look good. And I've known this also from watching Indiana football, not to directly compare Indiana football to IU basketball, but like, bad teams have good stretches. They're just not on a consistent basis. I feel like the Penn State was a good example of that. I feel like the Northwestern game was a good example of that. I feel like the Iowa game was a good example of that.
So I want to talk just a little bit about some of the individual players on this roster right now. I want to start with Miller Kopp, because he's a guy that's playing a ton of minutes. He only takes 3 shots yesterday in the game at Penn State. Meanwhile, Jalen Hood-Schifino took 15 shots. With Miller Kopp, I mean, is there anything Indiana could be doing differently with him? It seems like they don't really run anything for him, so you can't really look at his shot attempts and say it's him not being aggressive. But I think, for the minutes he plays, he plays 29 minutes yesterday, doesn't get a single rebound, didn't play great defensively. I just wonder, when you kind of look at a guy like that right now and the season's not going well, is this a situation where maybe he needs to play less and you look at some of the options on the bench and try to do something different? But, it seems like Mike Woodson's kind of ridden things out with Kopp here now for a significant stretch of time. But, for a guy to play 29 minutes, only take 3 shots, not grab a rebound in a 19-point road loss, that to me is a little bit head scratching.
He needs to shoot more. He hasn't shot enough the last few games. I mean, he's shooting really well from 3-point percent, like from 3. His 3-point percentage is really good. I think if you had said coming into the season that what he's shooting from 3 right now is what he would be, I think you would look at it as being, oh wow, that's a really good sign. But he's not being assertive enough. I think part of the problem is that I think he has grown in being able to create his own shot, but he's just so reliant on other guys creating for him. And I think that he has been maybe the most out of anybody on this team that has really hurt from Xavier Johnson being hurt, because Xavier Johnson would create a lot of opportunities, and Miller Kopp would benefit from that. I think, if you look down the line to who could take some of his minutes, I think CJ Gunn has made a case. He has definitely shown energy. He has shown fearlessness. I don't, his game isn't as polished as this point, just in terms of his experience. But if you're looking at, well, things need to be shaken up, I think CJ Gunn is definitely an option. I'm also, Anthony Leal is another guy that is just like, we don't really know if he's made development. I guess we can presume that he hasn't, because he's not seeing the floor, but like we haven't really seen much of it on the court. So like, we don't know if he has made progress. We just haven't had the opportunity to really see him play. So, I think, yeah, the problem is right now, I don't see one like easy fix. And so I don't think with this Indiana team as a whole, there's not like, oh, you can just plug in this guy and that's going to change. Like, I think putting in Trey Galloway into the starting lineup for Tamar Bates is like, okay, that might be a okay move, but the starting lineup really doesn't matter because Indiana can't do anything consistently. So yeah, you kind of need to, before anything else, they need to find that level of consistency. And I know I'm kind of going off, but Miller Kopp, bottom line, he needs to shoot more. They need to try running something for him, because he's most effective when he's making threes, and he can't make threes if he's not shooting them.
Yeah, the other guy that kind of falls in that same category, he's more assertive, takes more shots, but to me, he just disappears for long stretches, is Tamar Bates. And defensively, he's not, I would call him below average as a defender. He gets beat. You watched the game last night. There's a lot of times where he's overhelping, he's out of position, guys are getting wide open threes, and then he's not really making up for it on the other end of the court with any consistency. We had a couple games in the season, earlier in the season, where you thought, well, he's ready to break out. He's starting to figure it out. He's going to be that spark plug off the bench offensively. But really recently, I feel like he's regressed in terms of what he's bringing from an offensive standpoint, and the defense is just not up to par. What have you seen out of him recently? And what I mean, he's midway through his sophomore year now. I mean, he was a 5-star recruit. You never want to obviously give up on a guy who's still got a lot of talent. I just wonder, are we ever going to see the level of consistency that we thought maybe we would see from Bates, given his talent level and some of the things he's able to do from an offensive perspective? I just don't see the consistency on either end of the floor with him that maybe you would expect out of a player that came in with those type of accolades into college.
Yeah, it seemed like leading up to the Iowa game that he was kind of starting to figure things out. And I think this is a case of, in my opinion, that if he was going to continue in his role off the bench, being a spark off the bench, I think he fits that really well right now. But due to the injuries, due to what, Indiana needs of him, and I know he didn't start against Penn State, but regardless if he's starting, Indiana needs pretty much the same production out of him, whether he's starting or not at this point. But I think he's a case of, he has made strides from his freshman season, but it hasn't been as much as you would want and as much as Indiana needs, given the production it has lost from injury. So I think, he's another guy where, he has all the physical attributes. I think, he still has room to fill in his body, but he has length. He has athleticism, and he just hasn't put it all together yet. I think he's getting closer. I just think that he's one of those guys that would be a really good role player right now, but just isn't ready yet to take the responsibility and star in a bigger role, and that's just kind of how it goes sometimes with development. But, it's unfortunate that Indiana doesn't have the luxury of bringing him off the bench and being a guy that can fit into more of a niche role. But but just given the situation, you need guys to grow up really fast, and I think that Indiana has really lacked in terms of just having guys be able to step up in really quickly when it's needed.
Jalen Hood-Schifino is kind of the last individual guy I wanted to touch on. He obviously won Big Ten Freshman of the Week last week in 2 losses, which kind of says how well he scored the ball. It was interesting, I thought, after the Northwestern game, that on his radio show Monday night, that Mike Woodson said even though Hood-Schifino, I guess, scored 33 against Northwestern, he kind of let him know that his performance wasn't okay against Northwestern because of the turnovers and some of the defensive miscues. The other interesting thing about Hood-Schifino, you look at his offensive profile in KenPom, he's actually shooting better percentage on threes than he is twos, which is, given the volume of two, he's almost taken 100 2-pointers. He's only shooting 43.5%, but he's shooting 45.8% on threes, which is, you don't see that very, very often. I just think, there's been a pretty big drop off just in terms of the point guard position going from Xavier Johnson to Hood-Schifino. Yes, he scored the ball well, but I don't see him as nearly as good of a facilitator as Xavier Johnson. And his ability to defend has also been, I think, a little bit disappointing just based on, you look at his physical attributes and his quickness. He should be a better defender than this. I realize that he is a freshman, but, Indiana has to have better consistent point guard play if it's going to turn this around.
Yeah, I don't really fault him too much. I mean, I think there certainly have been flaws, but I think he's done an admirable job. It's a tough situation. Freshman coming in, then the veteran guy that he was playing alongside with gets hurt, and for a freshman in the Big Ten to basically be handed the keys as the point guard, that's a tough situation. I think the one thing that has stood out to me is that he doesn't really seem to get flustered often, if at all. He's very even keel, seems to have a lot of poise. And I think some of, his shot selection has gotten better. I think it could still continue to get better. And this is solely based on the eye test, but it feels like maybe that 2-point percentage is lower because he's taking some mid-range and extended mid-range jump shots, and you would maybe like him get to the rim a little bit more just given his size. But at this point, I don't really know if there's a better option to take shots than him. I think you saw what he did against Iowa. You saw what he did against Northwestern. He has the ability to carry Indiana's offense, and you want to cut down on those turnovers as well. But again, he's a freshman. He's in a tough situation right now. I think that he has done a good job overall. Like I said, there have been flaws, but I think that he has done a good job and good enough to put Indiana in position to win. I don't really fault him or Trace Jackson Davis much for the way Indiana's season has gone. I feel like it's more of a collection of the guys around them that are to blame at this point.
Yeah, I'm not being critical of him and saying that he's not played well enough. I just do think on defense, if you watched Indiana in that North Carolina game, when RJ Davis and Caleb Love were starting the offense, look at where the offense was being initiated on the court. And a lot of that was based on the ball pressure that Xavier Johnson was leading in that game. And then you watch the Northwestern game, and Northwestern's 10 feet closer to the basket when they're initiating their offense. They're kind of getting to the spots that they want to get to. And I think a lot of that starts with your point guard on defense. And I just think that, it's fine to acknowledge that Hood-Schifino has been a good offensive player. I just think defensively, they're missing a lot without having Xavier Johnson on the floor. Is that Hood-Schifino's fault necessarily? No, but he's also kind of the person that's taking that responsibility of guarding the other team's lead guard. And I just don't think he's bringing enough on that end of the floor. So he's a freshman. There's a lot of room to grow. I think he's going to continue to get better. I think overall he's done a fine job. I just think there's going to be more scrutiny on a player that's playing point guard, and I think that defensively he's got to get better. Kind of a loaded question here, Tyler, but how does this begin to get turned around? Is this a situation where Indiana's just going to have to wait for Xavier Johnson and Race Thompson to come back? Is there any? I mean, because we don't know when that's going to be. It doesn't seem like that's happening anytime soon. So there's a ton of games coming up here. They got Wisconsin, they got Illinois, Michigan State, I think Minnesota. Those are their next games coming up. I mean, you don't look at any of these and say if Indiana plays its best, they can't win, but you also just kind of look at the trend of where things are going, and there's not a lot of reasons to be optimistic. So is this a waiting game to get those guys back, or is there a chance to kind of turn things around and make adjustments and pick up some wins here in the more immediate future?
They have to find a way to stay afloat till you could possibly get Race Thompson and Xavier Johnson back. And that's an if. But I think it starts with the defense. The defensive regression has just been really impressively bad. It looked like, against Penn State, and I noted this, that it seemed like Indiana was playing defense with 4 guys on the court. Like, that's just how the rotations were such out of whack that it seemed like they were always running around and scrambling. It looked like they were playing with 4 guys obviously that wasn't the case, but just the discombobulation made it look like there were only 4 guys on the court. So I think, Indiana was in so many games last season just because of its defense. And I think the regression, I mean, Indiana scored enough to win against Northwestern. Indiana scored enough to win against Iowa, but the defense just let it down. And I think this is another case where, as I mentioned before, losing Xavier Johnson, losing Race Thompson does not help at all. Of course, those are 2 guys that are key to what Indiana does on both ends of the floor. However, just because you lose 2 guys to injury isn't an excuse to be that bad defensively. Like, you still have to find a way to stay in front of the ball. You still have to find a way to make sure you know what you're doing on your rotations. I think something that has hurt Indiana defensively, maybe not as much against Penn State, but before that is that second big man, whether that be Jordan Geronimo or Malik Renew, their inability to guard without fouling. I think Race Thompson might not be the greatest defender in the world, but he's going to at least be baseline of a standard defender, of an average defender. He might be better than average, but the drop off was so significant between him and who is behind him that it makes the defense more disconnected. And I don't want to put it all on Malik Renew and Jordan Geronimo, because obviously there's plenty of other factors too. But basically, you can't just stop doing everything that was going right for you last season because you lose a couple of guys. Like, good teams have guys step up and fill those roles, whether that be one guy, whether that be probably a collection of guys is what you would need to do. And that's just not happening.
Last IU basketball thing I want to touch with you, and then I also want to just quickly discuss some breaking news that just happened in terms of the Big Ten. But I figured you're a good person to ask this question because you're much younger than me and you're the same age as a lot of these players on IU's team. Earlier in this week, obviously, there's some back and forth on Instagram with IU players responding to a post, and it got some national attention, and different people were discussing it. We've heard Mike Woodson kind of say he doesn't want his players on social media, but he obviously can't control that. You grew up kind of in this era of being on Instagram, being on TikTok, being on Twitter, reading everything that's out there. And I know players are picking up their phones the minute they get in the locker room and looking at things. Just what do you think overall on guys responding to stuff like that? Is I would just say, that's something you have to ignore. You don't respond to. I got people saying stuff to me on Twitter all the time. I'm obviously not getting it in the same kind of way that players at IU are getting it, but it's just kind of a situation where when things aren't going well like this, something like that's magnified even more, and it kind of adds to this narrative that this team's not locked in from a mental standpoint. What was your reaction? Just the whole situation? Is it are we oversimplifying it to say IU players shouldn't read this stuff and shouldn't react to it? Do they have the right to kind of go out there and defend themselves and say what they want to say? And do you see it as an issue for this team in any way that they're kind of reading all this stuff and responding on social media?
Yeah, it's tough because for our generation, it's one of those things where it's not like I would say for most people, it seems like it's not like, oh, I'm gonna like choose to get Instagram or like choose to get Snapchat, choose to get Twitter. Like it's just something you have. Like we just grew up with it. Like that's a big way that people our age communicate, that that they interact with each other. And excuse me, so that's just something that like is part of our life. Like that's just something that has kind of been like we grew up with. We grew up knowing as part of our upbringing. And I think to say like just put it down, like I think that's more difficult than people might estimate. You know, it's obviously possible to do that, but like I said, just because of how ingrained it's been in our lives, and basically you have an app that like like Instagram maybe, where it's supposed to be a way to kind of express yourself positively, and it just like turns into a just negative hole just like instantly. I think it's hard to put that down because I know for like probably for me and maybe for a lot of other people, like it's hard to like go a long time without your phone at this point. We're just like so used to like, oh, you're waiting to get food, like I'm just gonna pull up my phone and like search this. Like it's just something that is kind of embedded in our society. So and I also want to say like it's almost impossible for us to like put ourselves in the shoes of these athletes. Like imagine us going to work and I write a terrible article. Say I write a horrible article and I just get blasted about it. Like that's not easy to like go to what you're supposed to do, like what you've basically poured your whole life into, and just get totally like annihilated about it like over and over. I can't probably fully put myself in their shoes to understand how difficult that is, where you're constantly being attacked. And again, look, they're basketball players. They also enjoy lots of luxuries that I guess people like, normal students don't enjoy. But at the same time, they're human. I think it's not necessarily there. You can understand both sides of this, where they are athletes. They do have maybe luxuries that other people don't have, but at the same time, they're still human. They still breathe the same air that we do. Like they're still gonna have emotions. They're still gonna have everything, all the emotions that anyone else could possibly feel. So I think it's just important to keep that in mind. I don't think it's as simple as saying, let's just put away social media. I think it's something that there's not one single solution to. You might just have to, work on it on a person by person basis. But no, I mean, I really think that it does just make being an athlete much more difficult.
Yeah, and it was a thing that even 5 or 6 years ago, there would be coaches who would try to ask their players or even ban them from social media during the season. And really now with NIL and opportunities for players to capitalize on their social media followings, it's not something that would even be allowed or considered for a coach to tell players to stay off of social media. So it's a very tough situation. It just seems like there's a bit of a disconnect, obviously, between Mike Woodson saying that he wants his players to kind of ignore that stuff, and obviously the players are not ignoring it. I don't know if there's maybe a way to meet in the middle on that and figure out a better solution going forward. As far as the breaking news in the Big Ten, Kevin Warren is leaving as Big Ten commissioner, according to multiple reports this morning, to go be the CEO and president of the Chicago Bears, which is something that's been rumored for a couple of weeks. Now has apparently come to fruition. Warren obviously took over for Jim Delaney just before the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. I remember one of his first trips to Big Ten school was at Indiana to kind of go to a basketball game and meet with all of the the various coaches, and he obviously was in charge of the Big Ten through the pandemic, and there was a lot of controversy with the football situation that season where the Big Ten wasn't going to play and the SEC and other conferences pushed to play. The Big Ten ended up playing, and then obviously Warren, got the Big Ten through its latest media rights deal, resulting in obviously a huge payday for all of the Big Ten institutions, adding UCLA and USC here in a couple of years. So it's a position where the Big Ten's in really good shape, and it'll be interesting to see just who the Big Ten targets as a potential replacement. It's obviously a very attractive job moving forward. Tyler, thank you once again for joining this week's show. It's always good to have you on. And where can fans continue to follow your work and read your stuff each week?
Tyler_T15. Yeah, that's my Twitter handle. I was just making sure I had that right. Yeah. You can follow me on there. Got stuff on the Indy Star. So always support Inside the Hall too. I'm a proud alum.
Yeah, we miss having you at Inside the Hall, but obviously we're thankful for the 2 years that you did spend writing for the site, and thank you for helping us identify two more students who have really done a terrific job this season. Amanda and William continue to produce great work for Inside the Hall. So we're happy for your success at the Indy Star, and also thanks to you for helping us bring in two more fantastic students to our staff. As for Podcast on the Brink, we've been on a little bit of an irregular schedule, but obviously with last night's loss going the way that it did, wanting to get a second episode out this week. We appreciate everybody, as always, for listening. If you enjoy the show, please leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, or leave us a rating on Spotify, and we'll be back soon with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.